Hi all, this is Tim Lightfellow in the Kingdom of Ontier in the Society for Creative Anachronism. Today's video is to discuss archery range courtesies within the SCA, which is to say things that may not be written rules but are things that can be done and in some cases are expected to be done to show courtesy to your fellow archers, the marshals, etc. And I may fit in a couple tips on just some general good practices that are slightly unrelated while I'm on these topics. So in discussing these, there are a lot of different aspects of them, and the way I'm going to break them down is kind of where they occur on the range. So I kind of separate them out to focus on the downrange stuff first, and then the shooting line and stuff, and then the behind the shooting line stuff, hoping that at least gives a little semblance of some organization to what could otherwise just be all kinds of random pieces of advice and information. So thinking about downrange, we're thinking about things like picking up your arrows, possibly finding other people's arrows, that kind of thing. So the first thing that is typically recommended is getting the short arrows first. So the closer they are to the shooting line, those are the ones you should be collecting first. What that does is, number one, as an archer, it helps you keep your arrows safe because the people following behind you, if they don't know they're there and you leave them till last, they could get stepped on and broken. Which then makes those archers feel bad, and it makes you feel bad because you're now down an arrow or two arrows or however many. And so pick those up first, get them out of everyone's way, and get them before there's a chance of them being stepped on and broken. At the target butt, if you have any shots that went beyond, one thing that's actually written in the rules and on tier, I know in Trimaris it's not in the rules, but they have some of the archers there have started doing it, is putting an arrow in the bale before you go behind. This can be a little hard with some of the types of target butts like the Saunders mats. Most of those are up on tripods, so you can see around them enough to see if someone's behind or not. But if you have like hay bales or one of the store-bought targets maybe that's on a stand, things like that, where you can't quite see around it, especially if someone's around the back of it bent over looking for arrows, then just taking your arrow and sticking it literally in the top of the bale, it can be a flag to the marshal that, hey, someone's back here. That way they know that when it comes time and they make their calls, they either see the flag and wait because they see someone's down there, or they may call, is it clear down range, and see if anyone responds. If not, they might turn and say, did someone leave their arrow in the bale? But that gives a flag that, you know, something's not quite right. Make sure we get this addressed before we consider opening the range and let people shoot. Pulling arrows. There's a couple aspects around this. So number one, don't pull someone else's arrows unless you have their permission. They may be scoring. They may just be trying to get their aim in and need to see where they hit. They may just be particular and just not want other people touching their arrows. All of that perfectly legit reasons. So unless you have their permission, you don't pull someone else's arrows. Another thing, and this is where this isn't really range courtesy, but since we're talking pulling arrows, I thought I'd mention, if this is in the target butt, this is the face, what you want to do is put your hand kind of against the face to hold it. Grab as close as you can to that to pull straight out, because if you grab back here, it's a lot easier to bend it as you pull it, and bent arrows don't shoot nearly as well as straight arrows do. Okay, if you're pulling if you see someone else's arrows in the ground as you're approaching the target butt, there are a couple ways that can be handled. A lot of times what we will do is we will carefully pull it out. You want to be careful not to damage the fletching as you pull the arrow loose from the ground. And then we'll stick it, again, like you would in the bale, only we'll stick it upright in the ground, because then other archers know there's an arrow there. They'll avoid it. And it still lets the archer who shot it see where it landed in case they're maybe walking their way up to the target distance or something and want to know where it landed. The other thing is, again, it may be that like the ground may be extra hard. I've seen people literally try to do that with the arrow in the ground and break the tip because the ground's too hard. Or it may just be that that's not accepted in the kingdom or region you're in. Another option is to just stand near it to keep anyone else from stepping on it until the owner comes out and you can say, you know, your arrows, one of them's right here. But the idea being, again, none of us wants broken arrows. And so we're trying to protect the arrow in some way within reason, so that the archer gets to keep shooting instead of not having enough arrows and being done for the day. Okay. One thing, again, as I kind of touched on, is if it's in the ground, depending on like how tough the grass or weeds or whatever it's around are, sometimes you can pull it backwards. Fine. You never want to grab it and pull straight up, because if this is all maybe caught in the ground, then you snap the arrow doing that. So you always want to pull it back out the way it went in if possible. But if you have too many weeds in that are going to just rip the fletches forward when you do it, the other thing you may have to do is find the tip end, grab the tip and pull it out that way, because that way all you're doing is smoothing the fletches flat and they'll come back to the way they should be. Okay, I'm looking at a cheat sheet as I go. I made some quick notes to try and make sure I don't forget to cover things. I probably still will. Commenting should be turned on when I share this, so if there are other things that I've failed to mention, please chime in. And again, some of these things may actually be rules in some kingdoms, but not others, and so I'm trying to mention what I can think of that may or may not be a rule, but is a range courtesy. Okay. Another one, speaking about being downranges, if someone's looking for arrows, and if you are comfortable doing so, we encourage people to help look for arrows. It can get awfully lonely when you feel like you're looking for your lost arrow, you're not having any luck, and everyone else is back behind the line, and you just have this feeling that, okay, everyone's staring at me, waiting for me to get back so that we can shoot, you know. So number one, if they have help looking, there's a better chance of finding it and finding it faster. Number two, if you have a lost arrow and it's taking, you know, take a reasonable amount of time to look for it, but it may be something where you say, okay, I've looked for it for a little while, can't find it. Everyone else is waiting on me. I'm going to go back. We're going to shoot the next end and then I can look again. Or I can, you know, I have enough arrows to go on. So after practice or after this event is done, or when there's a break, lunch break, whatever, I'll go out and spend more time looking for it when it's not going to prevent others from getting their shooting in. So a couple different aspects of that. And again, the same thing, if you're helping them find it, maybe they want to pull it themselves, or if you're comfortable doing it, as mentioned previously, there are ways to do it to make sure it's safe and doesn't damage the arrow. Okay, at the target butt itself, we already mentioned not pulling someone else's arrows. And again, this depends on situations. I know some places have multiple targets at each distance, and so it may be not an issue there. But if you have a situation where 3 of you, 4 of you, however many shot the same target. Typically what works best is the arrows that are more to the outside pull first, because if you're on the side and you're reaching into the center to grab your arrow, you could be bending, putting pressure on. I've even seen where an arrow got, like the knock of the arrow got stuck on someone's sleeve, and so as they pulled back, it just bent the arrow till it broke. So pull from the outside in, that way there's less chance of arrows getting bent or broken in the process. The addition to that I add, because I'm a crossbow shooter and crossbow bolts are not nearly as long as arrows, is longer generally. You know, if it's an even mix of whose is closer to the outside, longer usually pulls sooner than shorter, because again, they have a little more shaft they can get a hold of to pull theirs. I have to really get down into the middle to grab, you know, the front of the crossbow bolt. So let the people with the arrows pull first, and then I, with my crossbow bolts, pull after that. Okay. Let's see, so that's that. One thing I will note that we do on tier, and again, I don't know if any other kingdoms are doing it this way. I mentioned I know Trimaris is starting to have some archers who put an arrow in the bale. We expect to see 1 arrow per person who's behind the bale. So if 5 people are looking for an arrow and I'm the marshal, I should see 5 arrows in that bale. So I know that 5 people are back there. So it's literally 1 flag per person, because if 4 other people walk out and grab their arrow and don't realize the other person didn't have one in the bale, and they're still back there bent over looking for it, you know, then it's no longer a useful tool for the marshal, because there's no flag and the person's hiding essentially. Okay, so now on the shooting line. I have seen in some rules it's written, and I think some kingdoms probably follow this, where a new shooter on the range, especially at an event, is expected to go to the marshal and say, "May I fill in a spot?" Which allows the marshal to recognize them if they know them, or to recognize they need to do a quick equipment inspection because they don't know them. And then they can say, yeah, go ahead and take a spot. That's, from what I've seen within on tier, it's very uncommon. And especially like at practices and that, you'll know each other, and you just, you know, when the range is called open, you'll find a spot and go. So that said, one thing we don't do, and again, it's going to probably depend on your local group and the size of your group. We typically don't put bows on the shooting line. They go on a bow stand. Number one, it prevents anyone from stepping on it in any kind of situation where people are left feeling bad, like, did they intentionally step on and break my bow? Or, you know, I just stepped on someone's bow and broke it, and, you know, I'm using loaner gear. I can't even afford my own bow. Now what? Well, let's just not have those situations. Put the bow on the bow stand, on a chair, keep it off the ground where it's not likely to get stepped on. Again, if you're a small group, there's 3 or 4 you ever on the shooting line. I've shot York shoots where that's the case, and someone did, and they would just put their bow there every time, or they'd put it back, but they had like a little footmark or something. Then they'd come and sit on the line with their bow until we were all back and they called it open. So trying to offer advice, but also trying to acknowledge that some of it's situational, and where you're at, you may find that it's perfectly fine to do some of these things or not do. And so, okay. The other thing about the line, along with possibly being expected or choosing to ask to fill in a spot on the line, And this is one I personally do pretty much every time I take the line. Since I shoot crossbow, if I take the line and I'm behind someone who's already, I'm stepping in behind someone who's already shooting, I'm going to wait till they're in between shots, and I'm going to let them know there's a crossbow behind them. Because the noise of a crossbow is not the same as the noise of a handbow, and I don't want them at full draw starting to loose, then they hear me fire my crossbow, and they jump, and suddenly the arrow's going who knows where. Likewise, if it's someone I am consciously aware of being someone who's not been around crossbow, I might try and time my first shot so it's also between their shots, so they've heard the noise once before they shoot so that they know what to expect. Because again, startle reflex is not something we want to initiate. Okay. Let's see, another thing with being on the line, you want to make sure you each have enough space, especially like during a timed end. I've had situations where the archer and I thought we had enough space, and middle of the timed end, I'm bringing my crossbow down to cock it because I do a stirrup cock. They're tabling their bow to knock their next arrow, and limbs hit and throws off both our timing and throws off our timed ends. So making sure that there's enough space for each archer to function without, banging equipment on each other and that kind of thing. And sometimes it's a case of the archer adjusting. Sometimes, maybe you're at an event and there's 25 people shooting and you're shooting in waves, and you've got to use as tight space as possible. So maybe instead of tabling the bow, you have to hold the bow upright while you knock your arrow. Things like that can happen too, but generally at practices and that there's less people, that's less of an issue, but making sure you have enough space for what you're doing for timed ends, for regular ends, just being aware of the space around you and the space you need is very helpful. Let's see, don't leave bows on the ground. I already mentioned that. Okay. That's about all I can think of about on the line. If you're teaching, I usually try to stay behind the line while I'm talking to the archer who's on the line. Every once in a while, I might straddle the line like an archer, but I try to stay back. Also, if you're teaching, be aware of, sometimes you get really into the teaching and they may have stepped off the line because they shot the last arrow, but you're discussing something about their form or their technique with them. And so they're like right next to the line still with the bow, and maybe they were the last archer. Be aware of, you're done shooting. We can continue this discussion over at the bow rack. Let's go put the bow down so the marshal knows you're clear and not going to step up and shoot more. That way the marshal can keep the line going. And likewise with just anyone else, whether you're teaching or not, if someone asks you a question about, do you see me doing anything weird, whatever, just making sure that as we have those conversations, we're also moving away from the line when we're done shooting so that the marshal knows we're done shooting. Okay, if you're behind the line, you're working on a bow. Let's say, man, my aim point seems like it's a lot higher than normal. So I wonder if my knock bead's off. So you're behind the line, you're at your chair, you've got your kit out, you take your bow, you knock an arrow to look at it to see if the arrow's at an angle or if it looks straight. Technically, you are now behind the shooting line with a loaded weapon. So what I try to do if I expect to be doing that kind of thing for my own bow, for looking at or working on someone else's bow, is I try to make sure whoever the current marshal is knows that I'm going to be doing this, because then they're aware, they're not going to need to call a hold, and they're also aware that I'm acknowledging I know that this is something that's not normally allowed, and that I'm giving them the reason why I'm doing it. If they're not comfortable with that, that gives them the chance to say, you know what, if you need to knock an arrow, why don't you step to the very end of the line or a spot where no one's at and do that there while you're on the line. That way it's pointed down range and doesn't impact anyone. Or why don't you step, at our practice, we literally have the parking lot there. So they could also say, why don't you step between cars and point it back at that building? Because again, that way we're sure it's not pointing at anyone with an arrow on it. So that way the marshal has the chance to say, you know what, I'd be more comfortable with you doing this, or yeah, okay, thanks for telling me. Now I know you're safe. You know what you're doing, and I can not worry about it. So same thing comes with if you're drawing a bow. You may be checking to see if there's limb twist, and so you draw it a few times to see. Normally when I do that, I'll point it kind of down at the ground and draw it. But if I have to draw it, again, you don't draw a bow, point it at anyone, because from their perspective, is it loaded or not? Who knows? So step back, point it at the building, draw it there, step up to the line, point it down range, draw it there. Something that do whatever you can to keep from having it pointed at people while you're drawing it for whatever reason it is you're doing. If you're checking limb twist, if you're seeing if the string's right, if you thought you heard a bit of a crackling sound in the limbs and you're trying to see if you hear it, any of those things. And that last one, make sure you're not right next to others if you thought you heard crackling sounds, because that means if you did, the limbs could go at any time. So you wouldn't want to be standing right next to another archer testing to see if it's going to fail. Okay. Okay, so working on behind, things that don't draw bows, don't handle other people's bows or arrows without permission. Mentioned this a bit about pulling arrows, but also behind the line. We occasionally have like a public demo, and you might see someone just walk up and start pulling bows up to look at them, and it's like, hold on, let's discuss bows. And we can ask people for permission to let you look at them, but you don't just walk up and grab. And the same goes with experienced archers. We don't just walk up and grab each other's, bows and that. We ask for permission before we do. Hey, I've been curious about Ben Pearson bows. Can I take a look at your Colt and see how it feels? And so just again, courtesy, respectful of other people's property, respectful of other people, respectful of range safety. So those are all the things I've written down. That's pretty much what I can think of. I would mention, we generally don't want yelling on the range, or, people sitting in their chairs and yelling at someone who's shooting or being distracting to others. So as a potential audience person, as it were, non-participant, there we go, be respectful of what you're doing. Having a conversation with someone to understand what they're doing while they're on the line is one thing, but trying to make sure you aren't ruining the focus of the archer next to them, who might be getting ready to do a timed end or be in the middle of a scoring round or something that they're really trying to focus on. And I've had conversations where suddenly I hear my name and I'm in the middle of a timed end, and it's just like, okay, there went the focus. Who's talking about me and why? And sometimes that's going to happen. But just try to be aware of it and try to limit the amount that might happen. I think that covers everything. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it's my intent that when I post this, commenting will be allowed. And so if you have other things that I've left out, things that maybe are something in your kingdom that perhaps we have as a rule and I didn't think to mention, or, I just plain forgot, please comment, please add to it. I would have done this as a class so we had more discussion, but it is what it is, and I was able to get this done tonight. So hopefully it's helpful info, and hopefully others will contribute in the comments. Thank you, and have a good day.